Hello, my name is Dallin, and for the last 18 years or so, I've been learning, playing, writing, and recording music. These days, my instrument of choice happens to be the guitar, and I use my voice to inject meaning into my songs. I teach guitar lessons for a living, and I plan to create more content for the future. For the purposes of this video, I want to talk about my formidable years that led me to where I am today. In school, I was taught music theory. I played saxophone in jazz band, marching band, and even tried to join a music composition class, but ended up not passing the test for admission. Funny in retrospect, but this experience really drove me at the time to continue exploring music on my own, separate from instruction. I taught myself how to play the drums, bass, and guitar. I found profound meaning in my experiences with this adventure. As a kid, I loved the classic rock songs my father introduced me to. Bands like America, the Eagles, Collective Soul, and the like were all I would listen to. I found that a lot of modern music that my mother and sister would listen to felt empty in a way. To me, it felt like many songs had lost their soul or passion or whatever it was. As I grew older, I made new friends, and they eventually introduced me to a band that changed everything for me. It was around this time when I realized that being in jazz band, as much as I enjoyed playing the saxophone, just wasn't cool. Also, at this age is when I started to forget that girls have cooties. So that meant that being cool was a high priority. But I wasn't about to compromise my standards for music just to impress girls. I still felt very strongly that pop music was missing something, though I was beginning to ponder much deeper about this. Whatever it was missing, one night my friend showed me a song by this band he liked. That song was I Miss You by Blink-182. Now, I'm not saying that Blink-182 captured the essence of what was missing in modern pop music, but for me and my hormone-riddled adolescent brain, that song did something special. The song struck a chord with me that resonated so deeply that it altered the course of my life. I listened to the song on repeat shamelessly for several days after that, just wondering what it must have felt like for the band members to write the song. The emotion of the song just felt so raw and authentic. I romanticized the process in my mind, just trying to comprehend how someone could take an emotion from whatever they were feeling and condense it into a melody that others can feel. Surely, I thought to myself, this is the greatest form of expression a person can create. That someone might be able to share a feeling with anyone, anywhere, and that it might also resonate and inspire them. I immediately tried to form a band with my friends. I didn't care what instrument, that didn't matter. I just had to make music, and it had to be authentic. I played bass, and our band name was After Dark. We were going to be punk rock like Blink-182, and we were going to kick ass. Except we didn't. As fate would have it, After Dark was not meant to be. But I still had this itch for making music that needed to be scratched. So I asked my mom for a guitar, and she said no. See, what I should probably mention is that I already tried to teach myself guitar once before. I just had given up. But this time I insisted it would be different, so through sheer will, fate would grant me a new guitar. The other one was just too small now, at least in my rebellious teenage brain, so I began my journey. From the beginning, I wanted to write music. So that's what I did. I would struggle through learning how to play certain chords and notes. Today, I can't even remember what this process felt like. I just know it happened because from what I know how to play on the guitar, it must have happened. My mindset wasn't ever really on what notes I was playing too much, or even entirely focused on the song I was learning. To some degree, it was always on the dream I had to one day write music that impacted others the way my favorite music impacted me. So I would always take what things I had picked up for the guitar and immediately try to play around with it. I would think, what if I moved my finger to this fret or strummed it this way instead? And most of the time it didn't work. But over the years, it started to get better, and I started to develop an understanding for how the notes stretched across 6 strings and a fretboard and how they could feel together. Eventually, my friends started to take notice of the music I was putting together, and they were giving me a lot of encouragement. A thing I am grateful for, as they still do this to this day. It was through the encouragement of my friends that I began to see my goals take form. I realized that these songs were having an impact, and so I wrote, and wrote, and wrote. I wrote songs that would convey messages to loved ones that I could not communicate properly through mere words alone. I wrote songs that mended friendships. I even wrote songs that ended them. And through all this, I began to realize the tremendous power that music contains. I also realized that now that I have started this effort, I cannot stop. Whatever the creative force is that compels me to write, it is now part of who I am and always will be. So in a strange but very real sense, it's greater than me. So fast forward to today, I am writing and rewriting music and pondering my journey up to this point when I caught myself asking this question. This thing I've been creating all along, choosing notes on a fretboard and words to put to them, we call it music, but what exactly is it? I may share more on this story another time, but I tell you that much because the context is very relevant to the video essay I've prepared today. So now I'll start to ponder the question by exploring what the creative process has looked like for me all along. I've never really taken the time to try and describe what this is like before, but it's extremely relevant to this video, so I'll do my best to explain it clearly. While playing around on the guitar and doing what I call fiddling, which I'll describe as simply finding notes and song structures that work together, and mixing things around. Eventually, something I play grabs my attention. This very act feels much less like a specific conscious creation and more like a discovery I made in that moment. Then once I have a core idea, or in other words, the first discovery, I try to build off of that with more fiddling. An emotion or vibe begins to take shape with the project. And then from here, it really gets interesting. See, I've done a lot of thinking about this part of the process because it has always perplexed me. Rather than literally thinking through every note that I want to play to build from what I already have, instead, my mind has to take a back seat to the creative process, and something else takes over. My role now is to feel or hear it. Almost like the melody itself already existed somewhere, and I was just trying to figure it out. The strange thing is that this takes up the bulk of the creative process for me, at least with the guitar. And to my astonishment, this process is what a lot of artists and creatives describe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So with this realization, my inclination to think, I must know what music is because I write and play music, was shattered. Does anyone really write music? Or for that matter, does anyone really create art at all? Okay, so back to the drawing board here. The Oxford Dictionary defines music as vocal or instrumental sounds, or both, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. Okay, easy, right? Well, not really. Because not only does this define music entirely subjectively, but it also does not answer where it comes from. And as such, it does not adequately grant an understanding of what music is in any deeper sense. Furthermore, the vagueness of this definition leaves much up for interpretation. What qualifies as an instrument? I've heard cricket chirps being described as a song. A song is a musical composition. So a cricket's wings can be considered an instrument. And I think most people would agree with this. Then what about car horns in traffic? Basketballs make a thud when they bounce. Why not consider that a beat? What about thunder? Oh, you've gone too far now, I hear you saying. But have I? Consider for a second just what it is you think sets a car horn apart from the cricket's chirp or a bird's song. I personally might have said that it's the intent on the part of the musician to convey emotion that makes it music. But this seems to paint with broad strokes as well, because, well, do I not convey an intended emotion that differs depending on how long I play my car horn? Does the clap of thunder not draw emotion out of you depending on its tone and volume? After all, the words music and song are distinct for a reason. And only once something is described as a song does it then imply a composer. But music must produce beauty of form, so surely the thunder doesn't count. Are you serious with that one? Traffic sounds are awful and chaotic. Well, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, so then it may be true, for starters, that music can be found in all sorts of things, and its definition should be broad to allow for such interpretations of the meaning. Maybe that's the point. After all, much of music is up for interpretation, right? So we get to define what music is subjectively. Well, I don't think that works, because if we follow that line of thinking to its conclusion, then what's to stop us from defining everything as music? Because then if everything is music, then how do you distinguish music from math? How do you distinguish music from flatulence? No, we must define it. We have to do it clearly. Also, consider that there are things that everyone immediately recognizes as music, which is to say that some things with music are not merely up for interpretation. Some things are objective. So how do we define music? Well, in this section, we're going to take a look at theory and its relation to the physical world. After all, music exists in both areas, physically through vibrations and conceptually within the mind's interpretation. Music theory inhabits the conceptual side of music. It gives us a way to write down compositions and share them with others. Outside of the mind, music, in the form of sound, is the tones created by an instrument and the way that they resonate at a given frequency. We measure this frequency through hertz. These are two clear areas where music exists and how they are viewed today. Let's go deeper. Hertz represents the number of oscillations in a wave over 1 second of time. So an A at the standardized frequency of that note is 440 hertz, but it could have just as easily been standardized at 450 hertz. The reason we decided it should be 440 hertz is entirely arbitrary. It is just for convenience. We also have a 12-note chromatic scale. In terms of the physical world, the scale means we have also defined the frequency of each note going up to double the frequency of the original. So A sharp, for example, sits at about 466.164 hertz. Once we have doubled the frequency of the note, then the scale repeats again. This means that an octave above the standard A would be at the frequency of 880 hertz. And we do this because those two frequencies effectively sound like different versions of the same note. And so the note at 880 hertz frequency is also called A because, I don't know, some guy a long time ago decided that's how this should work. They're not the same note, but we perceive them to be very similar. Okay, so why? Why do we perceive the note at 440 hertz and a note at 880 hertz to sound so similar? Well, sound travels through the air in waves, and you can actually hear the oscillations if you practice listening for them. Lower notes are easier to hear because there are fewer oscillations that take place in a second. But anyways, in the case of A440 and A880, one wave oscillates exactly double the frequency of the other wave. And then the human brain takes over. Yep, the brain interprets the information, and this is why it sounds the way it does. Perhaps an alien being would hear the music we produce differently than how we hear it. Perhaps the ear canal of another being would allow for different interpretation of dissonant frequencies, or in other words, notes that sound off to us because of the way the oscillations enter our mind may not sound that way to another being. Or even more interestingly, the notes we perceive to resonate with one another may not do so for a member of another species. You may be thinking I've gone off on a wild tangent here, but in fact this is relevant because a cricket's chirp, while to us may just sound like a noise, to other crickets it may be a beautiful composition. So who are we to deny them the right to call this music? Indeed, we don't deny them this right. We almost unanimously acknowledge that they make their own music as well, even if we don't recognize its beauty. Okay, so what I've come to understand following this line of thought is that in order for music to be defined, there must be a mind of some kind to listen to it. However, it's also the case that we can intuitively qualify something as music even if our own mind cannot hear it as such, like with a cricket chirp. This means that music in its expression is often a subjective experience. But then why would there be such universal ways in which musical structures get interpreted? In music instruction, we often use emotive words to describe chords, such as this chord is sad or this chord is happy. In other words, I'm wondering why these frequencies should carry any emotional response within us at all, let alone one that matches the emotional response of others. This has to mean that at least some part of this emotion is carried by the frequency itself. But I've been taught that the reason for this is simply because that is how our mind perceives dissonant and resonant frequencies. It is that through our mind simply recognizing how well the frequencies in the sound compositions resonate. Or in other words, how well the vibrational waves fit together. But this does little to help me understand why a G chord like this does not carry the same feeling as something else in the G scale like this. These are made from the same frequencies. So no, I assert to you that it is not simply our minds processing vibrational sound energy. There's much more going on here. Let me see if I can move things along. We've established that music is not simply vibrational fuzz in the ear. I have to ask, does it even really require sound? There are certain species of bird who perform dances but do not sing, like the crested grebe. Is this not just another form of music? Poetry, in that respect, could also be considered music. But if music does require sound, then when does sound become music? Typing that exact question at the time of writing the script into Google yields this answer. According to Music Appreciation, sound becomes music when the brain decides if it is music. The brain perceives a traveling sound wave in the air, and if it is a regular frequency, then the human ear can pick up on it and perceive the pitch. Non-musical sounds are less regular or change frequency, so the human ear doesn't readily perceive pitch. For example, the snare and bass drum of a drum set can be heard, but it is hard to determine the exact pitch of either. So we're back to the same issue we've had all along. Music is defined as an entirely subjective and interpretive experience. Not only that, but the example given of non-musical sounds is drums. I understand what this is saying, but it ignores the fact that non-musical sounds, whatever that means, are used in music all the time. Plus, I'm not even convinced at this point that music requires sound at all. How else would Beethoven have been able to compose what he did? He had to experience the music with something more than his ears and his mind. I find all of this completely unsatisfactory, because this would imply that there was nothing to differentiate powerful music from whimsical music, except for perspective. It's only a matter of opinion. Nothing is missing from music of today, because nothing can be missing from music. It's all up for interpretation. This sort of undermines the whole endeavor of music theory as I see it, because it enables me to say that theory itself is just one man's opinion about how music is put together, and it shouldn't be appreciated. But this is not how we experience music. No, I found that studying music independently led me to the same understanding of how music should be structured, because I assert to you today that it's intuitive. Why should some music move us so powerfully if it wasn't intuitively comprehended? Universally, some songs seem to have the capacity to tug at the heart of whoever is listening. We don't even have to talk about music with lyrics that have injected meaning. Some music is purely instrumental, and it really can make us feel something. Just think of your favorite movie and imagine the climactic scene without any music playing. Just wouldn't have the same impact, would it? Even just playing the music on its own can make you feel the emotion. Not only that, but different people can feel an identical emotion from the same piece of music. How could this possibly be the case if music was entirely subjective? There are some objective properties about music. What are they? Well, as we discussed before, it requires a mind, or listener. I would argue that it only requires a listening mind, and not necessarily a composer. Because we experience new music the same way when we compose it or when we simply listen. Music persists in some kind of a supermind for anyone to pull from. But it appears to me another objective fact about music is that it carries emotion. You don't know something is music because it has patterns or because it rhymes. You know it's music because you feel that it's music. It comes from the part of the brain that processes emotion, which is part of the limbic system. The limbic system also governs the behaviors we need for survival: hunger, fight or flight, etc. So this means that our emotions, and by extension our ability to identify music, can be linked to the core of our experience as human beings. In other words, recognizing music is as deeply wired into you as recognizing food. Because your emotions can be drawn from you. For example, if I play an A chord and then an A minor chord, you can feel the emotional difference between these two chords. That is universal. That is not subjective. So how can the emotion within music be both a conceptual and personal experience, but also be a universal or objective one? It must also be transcendent in some way. There must be some property of music that allows it to exist harmoniously in both realms of mind and matter. Maybe music itself points to something that exists beyond subjective interpretations of the mind, because it comes from something that is neither purely physical or purely conceptual. Yet it also carries meaning outside of the human mind. If we simply define music as the physical representation of a being's emotion, might we then suppose what music actually is? I will assert that music is a physical manifestation of spirit. So then I must ask myself, would that make sense in how we experience music? Well, what is the definition of spirit? Oxford says spirit is the non-physical part of a person which is the seat of emotions and character, the soul. When I'm writing music, there is clearly something transcendent about how I interact with the process. I do not use my faculties made for this physical realm, nor do I use parts of my being that I need to conceptualize. Instead, I listen with my soul for how the melody presents itself to me, and I do my best to capture what I feel. Would this explain what I find missing in some music? Well, I do find it interesting that all along I've had an inclination to refer to what's missing as soul. But more than that, it would reveal to me something about the methodology of the composer. I could assert that someone who composes music primarily with their mind would produce music where you could actually be able to feel the lack of spirit. Music permeates identities and cultures. It strikes at the root of what makes us feel alive, and it is pre-existent to our physical experience. We merely listen and shape it, and we do not create it from nothing. For if it were only an interpretation of sound waves, how would it have the power to mend friendships? How could it communicate something more than what words alone could communicate? This explains the behaviors we see enacted by the appreciators of music. After all, if there were no soul in music and it was simply vibrational energy and interpretations of the mind, why would anyone ever go see someone perform live? When you're at a concert, the sound gets distorted by the other people in the crowd, the imperfections on the part of the performers. It smells bad. The sweaty guy behind you keeps yelling the wrong lyrics in your ear, but we love it anyway. Why? Because of the freshness and abundance of human spirit that we feel there. In summary, I have come to believe that through music appreciation, we find evidence for a soul. Yes, some of music is subjective, such as the lyrics, "Meet me in the morning." You can interpret this in different ways, but there is an objective standard in how we experience the play between notes, the emotion added in a cadence of a particular piece of poetry, or the way two bodies move in dance. And while this experience may differ across species, so does our capacity to see refracted light, or any of our other senses for that matter. There is, however, a standard from person to person for the feeling music will draw from us. This points to there being a very real connection between emotions and the way they manifest through such expression. Music is any medium that passes an emotion between beings. The only way this makes sense is if music comes from spirit, and not a naturalist spirit, but a spirit capable of carrying said emotion. So that way, instead of our minds interpreting the music all on its own with subjective meaning, there is a governance behind that interpretation that is the human soul. And that is the real source of music, and not only why we can create it with one another, but also why we need to do so. Music is what happens when you feed the soul and it rejoices. Or when split open, music is how the soul bleeds, needing no true composer except the mind of God, so that even thunder compels us to dance to its beat.